One day, the money in your wallet was just paper. In Germany, after World War I, people used wheelbarrows of cash to buy a loaf of bread. During the Great Depression, thousands of banks across the United States simply locked their doors, taking people's life savings with them. Imagine that, but everywhere all at once, with no hope of it ever coming back. Millions starved, not because there was no food, but because no one had anything of value to trade for it, and the systems to distribute it had crumbled. In this world, your neighbor didn't just lose their job. They might eye your last can of beans with a desperate glint in their eye, and there would be no police to call. Global trade, the intricate web that brought coffee to your cup and fuel to your car, simply ceased to exist. Ships rusted in harbors, their crews long gone, their cargoes unclaimed or looted. The interconnected world economy, which had seemed so robust, unraveled thread by thread until there was nothing left but isolated pockets of humanity struggling for survival. Number 7. When your bank account became toilet paper, the year is 193X. The stock market crash wasn't just a dip. It was a chasm that swallowed economies whole. Governments, desperate to pay off debts or stimulate growth, started printing money. At first, it was a trickle, then a flood. In Berlin, Vienna, Warsaw, then New York, London, and Tokyo, the value of currency plummeted not day by day, but hour by hour. Your weekly wages, if you were still lucky enough to have a job, might not buy a loaf of bread by the time you reached the bakery. People who had trusted banks found their savings accounts empty. The institutions themselves shuttered, their marble facades defaced with angry graffiti. The concept of a bank became a bitter joke. Gold and silver, once the bedrock of monetary systems, vanished from sight. Hoarded by a few, they became too dangerous to display or trade openly. If you had gold, you also had a target on your back. People resorted to barter. But how do you trade a skill like carpentry for a sack of potatoes when the carpenter is starving today and the potatoes won't be harvested for weeks? Complex transactions, the kind needed to run a factory or build a bridge, became impossible. The intricate dance of credit and debt that underpinned society seized up. Some communities tried to create their own local currencies, scrip printed on rough paper, wooden tokens, even handwritten ayahs. But trust was a scarcer commodity than food. These local efforts often collapsed within weeks, undermined by counterfeiting or the simple brutal reality that a piece of paper from a neighboring town meant nothing when armed gangs patrolled the roads between them. The only money that held any value was an item with immediate, practical use. A handful of rifle cartridges, a bottle of iodine, a packet of pre-depression cigarettes, a sturdy pair of boots. These became the de facto currency, their exchange rates fluctuating wildly based on immediate need and perceived threat. A can of peaches might be worth a single bullet one day, a dozen the next, if rumors of bandits intensified. People literally burned piles of worthless banknotes for warmth in the bitter winters. They used stock certificates and bonds as insulation, or more commonly for sanitation. The phrase, "cash is king," became a relic of a lost world. Now, only desperation reigned, and the only thing of true value was the ability to survive until the next sunrise. Financial ledgers and account books from the old world gathered dust in abandoned bank vaults, incomprehensible artifacts of a civilization that had priced itself into oblivion. The idea of investing for the future, of saving, of economic growth, these were fairy tales whispered by the elderly to uncomprehending children who had only ever known a world where the only value was what you could hold in your hand and defend with your life. Number 6. Dinner time meant fighting for your life. Before the Great Collapse, Hunger was a problem for the unfortunate, the marginalized. There were bread lines, yes, and soup kitchens run by charities. Farmers struggled sometimes dumping milk or slaughtering livestock because prices were too low to cover costs. The Dust Bowl turned fertile plains into deserts, driving families from their land. But these were seen as crises within a system. What happened next was the system's utter disintegration. As currencies became worthless and governments dissolved, the organized production and distribution of food ceased. Commercial farms, reliant on fuel for tractors, fertilizers from distant factories, and markets to sell their goods, went fallow. The logistics of moving food from countryside to city broke down. Roads became dangerous gauntlets, bridges collapsed, and trains stopped running. Who would risk their life to transport grain when payment was uncertain and bandits were a certainty? In the cities, grocery stores were looted bare within days, then burned. Urban gardens, in parks and on rooftops, became battlegrounds. Pigeons, rats, and stray dogs, once urban pests, became sought-after protein. The whispers started slowly, then grew louder. Stories of people disappearing, of strange meats sold in darkened alleyways. Cannibalism, the ultimate taboo, became a grim reality in the most desperate enclaves. In the countryside, farmers who still had viable land turned their properties into fortresses. Barbed wire, armed guards, and makeshift watchtowers became common. They grew enough for their own families, and perhaps a small trusted group, bartering surplus only for essential goods they couldn't produce, like ammunition or medicine. Raids on these fortified farms were frequent and bloody, launched by starving city dwellers or roving gangs. Many farming families were wiped out, their hoarded supplies plundered, their fields left to weeds. Foraging became a way of life for many. People scoured forests and fields for edible plants, roots, and insects. Knowledge of what was safe to eat and what was poisonous spread by word of mouth, often learned through tragic trial and error. Hunting depleted local game populations rapidly. A single deer could mean the difference between survival and starvation for a small group, and its pursuit was often a deadly contest between rival hunters. Children suffered the most. Their small bodies, already weakened by malnutrition, succumbed easily to disease. Images of bloated bellies and skeletal limbs became commonplace. Concept of a family meal, once a daily ritual, transformed. Dinner time, if there was anything to eat at all, was often a tense, fearful affair, eaten quickly, in silence, with ears straining for any sound of approaching danger. The primal urge to feed oneself and one's offspring overrode all other social conventions. Sharing became a luxury few could afford, and protecting your meager food supply became a constant life or death struggle. Number 5. Why skyscrapers became tombs. Cities were once the glittering symbols of progress, hubs of commerce, culture, and innovation. Their towering skyscrapers reached for the heavens, symbols of human ambition. During the early Depression, they swelled with desperate people from the countryside seeking non-existent jobs, leading to the rise of Hoovervilles, shantytowns, built from scrap. But even in those hard times, the basic infrastructure of the city, while strained, still functioned. Water flowed from taps, electricity powered lights, and sanitation systems, however imperfectly, kept diseases somewhat at bay. When the broader collapse into anarchy hit, these metropolises transformed into concrete jungles of death. The first thing to go was power. Without electricity, the cities plunged into darkness each night. Elevators stopped trapping people in high-rises or forcing them into grueling, dangerous climbs up and down countless flights of stairs. Water pumps ceased to function, taps ran dry. Sanitation systems backed up, and human waste accumulated in streets and buildings, creating a perfect breeding ground for disease. The skyscrapers, marvels of engineering, became vertical tombs. Without maintenance, they began to decay. Windows shattered, facades crumbled. Gangs and warlords claimed entire buildings or blocks, turning them into fortified fiefdoms. Fights for control of a particular floor or even a single apartment were brutal and constant. Snipers used the high vantage points to control streets below. Fires, once started, raged unchecked as there were no fire departments to respond. Entire sections of cities burned for days, the smoke-filled skies a constant reminder of the chaos. Food, already scarce, became almost impossible to find in these urban wastelands. The supply lines were cut. Any remaining stores were long since looted. The only sources were dangerous foraging missions into the surrounding, equally hostile countryside, or preying on weaker groups within the city itself. Disease spread like wildfire. Cholera, typhoid, dysentery, fueled by the lack of clean water and sanitation, swept through the densely packed populations. The dead were often left where they fell, or thrown from windows, further contaminating the environment. The sheer density of people, once a city's strength, became its fatal weakness. It concentrated targets for violence, made escape difficult, and accelerated the spread of pestilence. The air, thick with the stench of decay, smoke, and unwashed bodies, was a palpable miasma. For those trapped within, escape was a desperate dream. But the roads leading out were choked with other refugees, patrolled by predators, and led to a countryside that offered little solace. The great cities, once humanity's proudest achievement, became monuments to its downfall, their silent, empty towers standing as grim cenotaphs over a landscape of despair. Number 4. The day we forgot how to make a light bulb. The Great Depression had already put immense strain on educational systems. Schools closed or shortened their years, teachers went unpaid, and families, struggling for basic survival, pulled children out of school to work or scavenge. University enrollment plummeted. The focus was on immediate needs, not on the cultivation of knowledge or the pursuit of science. This trend, when amplified by global anarchy, led to a catastrophic loss of human knowledge. As societies fractured and governments vanished, institutions of learning crumbled. Universities were looted for supplies, their libraries ransacked or burned for fuel. Schools became shelters or strongholds. There were no teachers, no students, no organized way to pass on knowledge from one generation to the next. The scientists, engineers, doctors, and technicians who possessed specialized skills became targets, hoarded by warlords for their practical use, or they simply died off, taking their knowledge with them. Books themselves became precious, rare objects, but not always for their content. Paper was useful for starting fires, or as makeshift insulation. The accumulated wisdom of centuries, stored in libraries and archives, went up in smoke or rotted in damp, abandoned buildings. Oral traditions, strong in some cultures, might preserve basic survival skills, but complex scientific principles, engineering schematics, or advanced medical procedures could not be easily memorized or transmitted. The consequences were stark. Complex machinery, from power plants to water pumps to simple engines, broke down and could not be repaired. No one remembered how. The knowledge of metallurgy, electronics, chemistry, and advanced agriculture faded. People might know how to sharpen a piece of metal into a blade, but not how to smelt ore to create new steel. They might know which plants were edible, but not the principles of crop rotation or hybridization that had fed billions. Society regressed technologically. Tools became simpler, cruder. The ability to generate electricity, purify water on a large scale, or mass-produce goods was lost. Life became localized, dependent on what could be made or found by hand. The intricate web of specialized knowledge that allowed for modern conveniences, even something as basic as a light bulb or a reliable antibiotic, unraveled. A new dark age descended. But this one was different. It wasn't just a period of societal decline. It was an age of forgetting. The memory of what humanity had once been capable of building and understanding became distorted, passed down as myths or legends of a magical past. Children grew up in a world where the ruins of the old civilization, crumbling skyscrapers, rusted cars, silent factories, were inexplicable wonders, like the monuments of a long-lost alien race. The path back to that level of understanding and capability became impossibly steep. Perhaps lost forever because the foundational knowledge itself had evaporated into the smoke of burning libraries and the silence of the uneducated dead. Number 3. Every town a tiny, angry kingdom. The economic nationalism and political extremism that festered during the Great Depression were early symptoms. As global trade collapsed and trust between nations evaporated, the idea of a unified national identity began to fray. When central governments proved utterly incapable of providing security, food, or any semblance of order during the slide into anarchy, they simply ceased to exist as meaningful entities. Their authority vanished, their pronouncements ignored. In their place, power devolved to the most local and often most brutal levels. Individual towns, remote villages, even city neighborhoods or strong city blocks became isolated, self-governing entities. These were not utopian communes born of shared ideals. They were micro-kingdoms carved out by whoever had the strength, charisma, or ruthlessness to seize control. A former factory foreman with a loyal crew of workers might declare himself mayor of his district. A monastic preacher might lead his congregation to take over a small town, promising divine protection in exchange for absolute obedience. More often, it was simply the gang with the most guns. Each tiny kingdom was fiercely independent and deeply suspicious of all outsiders. The concept of a nation became a forgotten dream. Loyalty extended only as far as the town walls or the barricades at the end of the street. Strangers were by default enemies, potential spies, raiders, or carriers of disease. Border disputes, which once involved armies and diplomats, now involved a dozen armed men fighting over a well, a patch of fertile ground, or a bridge. Laws were arbitrary, dictated by the local warlord or council of elders, and often changed with their whims or the shifting balance of power. Justice was swift and brutal, often public, designed to instill fear and maintain control. There was no appeal, no higher authority. If you fell afoul of the local ruler, your fate was sealed. Trade between these enclaves was minimal and fraught with peril. Convoy carrying goods from one village to another was a tempting target for bandits or rival warlords. Most communities aimed for self-sufficiency, an almost impossible goal that led to constant scarcity and desperation. This, in turn, fueled further conflict. King of one settlement might eye the meager resources of a neighboring one, leading to perpetual small-scale warfare. Alliances were temporary, pragmatic, and easily broken. Betrayal was a common tool of statecraft in this fractured world. Travel became a life-threatening endeavor. Roads were unmaintained and dangerous, haunted by scavengers and armed groups. Moving from one kingdom to another required either incredible stealth, overwhelming force, or the payment of exorbitant tolls to whatever group controlled the route. The world shrank to the limits of one's immediate, defensible surroundings. The idea of a common humanity, of shared rights or responsibilities, withered and died in the face of this relentless, hyperlocal struggle for survival. Every settlement was an island, its inhabitants marooned in a sea of chaos, their only concern the defense of their tiny, angry realm. Number 2. When the common cold could kill an entire village. Even before the total collapse, the Great Depression had taken a toll on public health. Malnutrition weakened immune systems, making people more susceptible to common illnesses. Access to doctors and medicine became a luxury for many. Hospitals struggled with funding. These were problems within a system that still, however imperfectly, understood disease and possessed the tools to combat many of its forms. When anarchy descended, this entire framework vanished. The organized production of pharmaceuticals, antibiotics, vaccines, even simple painkillers ceased. Factories were abandoned, their supply chains broken. The knowledge to synthesize these drugs was held by a dwindling number of specialists who were either killed, died of disease themselves, or were unable to practice without laboratories and raw materials. Doctors and nurses became prime targets for abduction by warlords seeking to secure their skills, or they were simply overwhelmed by the sheer scale of suffering and lack of resources. Hygiene, already deteriorating with the collapse of sanitation in urban areas, became a forgotten concept for many. Clean water was a precious rarity. Soap was a forgotten luxury. In these conditions, diseases that had been largely conquered in the developed world made a terrifying resurgence. Cholera, spread by contaminated water swept through refugee camps and ruined cities. Typhoid, dysentery, and rampant intestinal parasites became common killers. Tuberculosis, already a concern during the Depression, spread unchecked in crowded, unsanitary living conditions. Without vaccines, childhood diseases like measles, mumps, and polio returned with a vengeance, crippling or killing vast numbers of children. A simple scratch could become infected, leading to sepsis and a painful death, as there were no antibiotics to halt the infection. Influenza, the common flu which even in normal times could be dangerous for the vulnerable, became a mass killer, especially when combined with widespread malnutrition. Imagine a common cold, but with no medicine to ease the symptoms, no doctor to consult if it worsened into pneumonia, and a body already weakened by hunger. Could easily become a death sentence, not just for an individual, but in a small, isolated community, for everyone. Outbreaks of even more fearsome diseases, once confined to history books, began to appear. Bubonic plague, carried by fleas on rats that thrived in the filth, re-emerged in pockets. Smallpox, if it found a foothold, could decimate populations lacking any immunity. New diseases or mutations of old ones could arise and spread without any scientific body to identify, track, or combat them. Folk remedies and traditional herbalism saw a resurgence, some perhaps offering minor relief, others dangerously ineffective or harmful. Superstition often replaced medical understanding. Sickness was attributed to curses, bad omens, or divine punishment. The average lifespan plummeted to levels not seen since the darkest medieval times. Dying from an infection, a preventable disease, or a minor injury became the norm, not the exception. The sophisticated medical knowledge of the early 20th century became another lost treasure of a vanished world. Number 1. The ghost fleets searching for a new world that wasn't there. As the continents descended into unrelenting chaos, as cities became charnel houses, farmland turned into battlegrounds, and disease scythed through the starving populations, a final, desperate hope flickered in the hearts of a few. The sea. Those who lived near coasts, or who could fight their way to them, began to look towards the vast empty oceans as a potential escape. The dream was to find an untouched island, a mythical continent spared from the global collapse, a place where they could start anew. This wasn't an organized exodus. There were no governments left to coordinate such a thing. Instead, it was a chaotic scramble for anything that could float. Old cargo ships, fishing trawlers, luxury yachts seized from their former owners, even makeshift rafts, anything that offered a chance, however slim, to leave the dying lands behind. Those with maritime skills, or simply the brutality to take command, became captains of these desperate flotillas. The oceans, however, offered no salvation. They were not empty paradises, but vast, indifferent wildernesses. The ships, often poorly maintained and overloaded with refugees, were ill-equipped for long voyages. Storms, common on the open sea, battered the rickety vessels, sending many to the bottom with all hands. Food and fresh water, already scarce on land, became critical issues at sea. Stores ran out, and attempts at fishing were often insufficient to feed the hundreds, sometimes thousands crammed aboard a single vessel. Disease, rampant on land, found fertile ground on these crowded, unsanitary ships. Outbreaks of scurvy, dysentery, and respiratory illnesses decimated the passengers and crew. There was no medical aid, nowhere to quarantine the sick. The dead were simply cast overboard. Some ships turned to piracy, preying on weaker vessels in a desperate struggle for their dwindling supply. Brief, brutal naval battles were fought, with makeshift weapons far from any shore. The dream of a peaceful new beginning quickly devolved into the same anarchic violence they had sought to escape. Navigational knowledge was often lost or imperfect. Many ships sailed aimlessly, their crews slowly succumbing to starvation, thirst, and despair, becoming true ghost ships, drifting with their dead. The few who did make landfall often found islands that were either barren and uninhabitable, already stripped of resources, or worse, populated by others who had arrived earlier and were just as desperate and hostile. The mythical untouched paradise simply didn't exist. The collapse had been truly global. The great land masses they had fled were mirrored by the desolation they found across the seas. The last remnants of these ghost fleets, their hulls leaking, their sails tattered, their crews skeletal and mad, eventually foundered on remote shores or sank without a trace in the vastness of the ocean. The sea, which had once been a highway for global trade and exploration, became the final graveyard for humanity's broken dream of escape. The silence of the empty oceans was broken only by the cry of seabirds and the sigh of the wind over the waves, a mournful dirge for a world that had consumed itself.